Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Margaret Mbintio. I am an academic advisor and also an assistant professor in the Department of Academic Advisement and Student Development. We are so grateful to see you here today. Please feel welcome. We have a wonderful session ahead of us. And I am going to invite the speaker shortly, but I would like to read a bio. Probably some of you have seen a bio, but I'm going to read it anyway. So our speaker today is Dr. Rayne Sperling. And Dr. Rayne Sperling is an educational psychology professor and also the Associate Dean for the Undergraduate and Graduate Studies in the College of Education at Pennsylvania State University or Penn State. Our research examines students' self-regulated learning and focuses on effective motivation, metacognition, and strategic processing for academic success. Our work also addresses effective instructional manipulations in both traditional and technology-rich environments that are designed to promote learners' self-regulation, comprehension, decision-making, and problem-solving. Much of our work addresses issues of objective-based student assessment, construct measurement, and evaluation. And so we are so grateful to have her here talk to us. She brought along with her our two graduate assistants, and you are very welcome, Dr. Rayne. We are so grateful that you found time and you said yes to come and talk to our students. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I did bring with me today Joseph Tice, who is a graduate student in educational psychology. He's finishing up his doctorate degree, and he studies self-regulated learning, specifically elaborative processing. And I also brought Ing Wang with me today. She's also finishing her doctoral program, and she studies metacognition. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some effective strategies and think through some of the things that we do when we're studying that can help us be successful. And we're going to do some little exercises. There'll be some opportunities for you to participate in and try some new things out. And then we'll sort of have a final discussion at the end. So that's our plan for today. I welcome you all here, and please feel free to use the chat or to raise your hand, and we will go from there. Ing is going to be using our slides.
All right, thanks, Rayne, for the introduction. It's great to be here and to see everybody. We're really excited about this talk, and I think it'll be informative, maybe a little bit fun, hopefully a little bit fun. And I think you'll be able to walk away from this session with a couple of strategies in hand that you can use to be a more efficient learner. So to start out, let's do a little warm up. We have a list of learning scenarios here for you, and I want to get a sense of what you would do right now if you were tasked with each of these scenarios. And I want everybody to actually record on a piece of paper or in a Word document if you're on your computer or something like that, your answers for each of these, because we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. So yeah, if you don't mind just kind of recording them, and I'll ask a couple people to share what they put down. So let's say you have a list of vocabulary terms that you want to know. Think about what you would do to learn that list of vocabulary terms. Or you have numerous math homework problems to complete. What is your approach to completing those math homework problems? Let's say you need to learn from a textbook, so you need to read the textbook and understand something. What's your approach for that particular scenario? Let's say it's finals time at the end of the semester and you need to prepare for a cumulative final. What are you going to do to prepare for that? And then finally, let's say you have a research paper that's due in a few weeks from now. What's your approach for that? So think about, I'll give you a minute or two to kind of think about what your approaches would be for each of these scenarios. As you kind of finish writing down your answers, does anybody have, right off the top of their head, an answer for the first scenario? Like, what would you do if you were going to learn a vocabulary list? Madison, you want to go ahead? we might have to unmute you ourselves. Okay. How does that work?
It just asked to unmute. Who do you want me to ask to unmute?
Oh,
Okay,
Madison, there you go. Yep.
it worked. I would immediately put them into Quizlet and study them that way because that helps me the most. And it's like flashcards, but I'll have them forever.
Okay. Yep. Great. Yeah, I've heard a lot of, Quizlet, definitely very popular, very popular. Okay, let's say that you need to learn from reading a textbook. Who has an idea of what they would do if you were reading a textbook? Yeah, it's also okay if you want to, you can put your answer in the chat box as well, and I can read it out to you. You don't feel like.
Oh, sorry. I just realized I was still muted. I would write down the subtitles for the chapter that I'm reading and then summarize what I read for each like subsection.
Okay, great. Good stuff. How about, what about studying for a cumulative exam, a final exam? What's an approach that you would take for that one? Okay. All right, Madison?
I would make like personal study guides based on each unit that I need to prepare for.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes teachers don't provide study guides, so you have to make your own. But if the teacher provides them, then print out all those study guides and put them together and go over them again.
Okay, great. All right, let's get one more answer. Anybody want to share what they would do for any of these scenarios? One more answer. Oh, I see. Okay, how about, I think I saw Christopher's hand first.
I would say for the research paper, what I do is like every day I set like a goal of how much of the paper I wish to complete so that I can complete and give me enough time to like go through it and review.
Right. Yeah, great strategy, kind of breaking it up into sub goals. Love that. All right. And I think, so these are all really great strategies. And we're gonna, like I said, we'll revisit these. So if you didn't get to share yours, this time around at the end, we'll kind of ask for people to revisit and share their strategies. And so I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Ing.
Thanks, Joe. So I heard that many of you have shared very good self-regulatory strategies for study. So here I'm just going to briefly talk about self-regular learning. So students are self-regulated to the extent that they are motivationally, metacognitively, and behaviorally active participants in their own learning. And what that means is that when students who are self-regulated are learning, they have adaptive motivation. And by that means they set appropriate learning goals for a particular learning task, and they will adapt their learning goals to correspond a particular task. They also know about what they know, and they also know about their skills very well, so that they can use appropriate strategies for certain learning tasks. And then they use effective learning strategies to overcome learning obstacles whenever they're completing a certain learning tasks. And they also have knowledge about the content. So these are the very general components of self-regular learners. So in this presentation, we talk about self-regular learning by describing this specific framework. We call that as the Sdsrl Framework. So as you see from this graphic, in this framework, we have 5 components. They are metacognition, strategy use, motivation, management, and content. And metacognition, briefly, it refers to students' awareness of their learning and regulation. Strategy use refers to whether students are able to use strategies effectively for a particular learning task. And motivation is simply what keeps students going. It can be, as we said earlier, it can be the learning goals that they set for a particular learning task. And management here we refer to these time and resource management tools. For example, a planner can be a management tool. And content is students' content learning. So as what you can also see from this graphic is that these 5 components, they all interrelate to each other, and they all work together to support students' learning and help students to succeed academically. So that is the overview of this framework. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rayne to talk about the next part.
I'm going to talk a little bit about metacognition, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how we learn and how information is processed and things that we can do to sort of help that process along. So metacognition refers to, sometimes people say it's thinking about thinking or learning about learning, but it's thinking about your own learning and how your knowledge of how you learn, and when you know or don't know something, when you understand or don't understand something. And to do this, you sort of stop and ask yourself questions, right? You interrogate your own understanding. Students that are metacognitive make plans, they monitor their learning, they monitor their goals, they self-check their performance. After they've done some sort of performance, they evaluate how well they did. We also say that they debug errors. So if they're making mistakes, they sort of figure out where those mistakes are and fix them. And they're not afraid to make changes in their own learning. So metacognition, it seems like it would be intuitive that everybody is metacognitive, but that's not necessarily the case. Students are not particularly good at knowing when they know something and knowing when they don't know something. And the other thing about metacognition that's so important when we think about self-regulated learning is that if you don't recognize that you're not being a successful learner, or if you don't recognize that you don't understand something, you're less likely to use a strategy. And so really at the foundation of self-regulated learning is metacognition and your awareness of your own learning. I'll give you a little example. So go ahead and read this passage. It'll just take you about 10 seconds. So when you read this, I can't see everybody. When you read this, or when I work with some students, first-year students, and sometimes high school students, you know, they read this and they say, "Oh, well, I get it. I can read all the words. I understand it." But then when you start to interrogate your reading, you say, "Okay, well, wait a minute. Why if he was cold, why did he take off his coat? Why did he roll down the window? Why did he get out of the car as quickly as possible?" You start to ask yourself why questions and start to interrogate your understanding, and you realize that you don't really know what's going on here, right? You may be able to read all of the words, but that's different than actual comprehension or understanding. The title of this particular passage is Submerged Vehicle, and it makes sense, right? Then the whole thing kind of comes together and you can understand it. So metacognition is foundational. Okay? When we think about how we process information and how we learn, many of you've probably taken a cognitive psychology class or an intro to psychology class, and you've talked about this before in your classes. And so what we want to do today is talk about it within the context of our own learning, right? But all information is collected from our environment, and we add meaning to that information through the processes of perception. Okay. And we need to filter out, we can't attend to everything, right? Attention's within our control. We must filter out and select what's necessary to give our attention and not be distracted by things that are not important, right? But remember, attention is in our control. This is just an information processing model of memory, and you'll see, we're not going to talk about this in great detail today, but you'll see the double-sided arrow, that's the attentional processes. We're going to talk about those today. And then we're going to talk about how we make information meaningful when we talk about encoding and retrieval from long-term memory. So those are the two focal points of our discussion today. So attention. We literally can only attend to one thing at a time, but we can select or choose where we attend. And when we attend to things, we add meaning and we start to construct for understanding. And we do that based upon what we already know or the context within which we are learning. Again, our attentional processes are largely controllable, so it's an opportunity to use some strategies, but we can't attend indefinitely. Some of you've seen this before. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but you can see that there's young woman or old woman. It's been referred to before, and it's difficult, right, to attend to both at the same time. In fact, you really can't. So this just demonstrates the property of attention, that we can really only attend to one thing at a time. And this is important for studying, right? Because students really do say a lot of the time, like, oh, I can watch TV and study at the same time. I can read my textbook and play a game on my phone at the same time. And you can't. And so what ends up happening is you do one and then you do the other. You do one, then you do the other. And you might be doing that switching back and forth very quickly, so you don't perceive that you're not really attending to both, but in fact, it is a distraction to your learning. And so one of the things that we're going to kind of talk about is how to limit those distractions. So go ahead and read this. Click. Okay, go ahead and write down what you saw. Now go ahead and count the number of words that you have on your paper. And then we'll click here and count the number of words on the screen. Some of you probably have a different number of words than you're seeing on the screen right now, because some of you probably didn't attend to the two thes in this visual display. Okay. So this demonstrates a couple things. When you were asked to read this, and some of you, of course, caught it the first time, and you'll be on to us now because we're going to be playing tricks all day. But some of you probably did see the two thes the first time, but many of you probably just read right over them because you were trying to construct meaning through your attentional processes, and no one would think that there's two thes there. When I asked you to direct your attention to counting, it changed the task, and you were able to find those two thes. Let's do another one. Go ahead and read this from right to left. Click. Okay. Hopefully you wrote that down. Now let's go ahead and read it again from right to left. In this case, the cat ate the, some of you probably put the cat ate the rat. Not that I really think cats eat rats, but maybe they do. But we think that anyway. In this case, it's the cat ate the tar, but that doesn't make any sense, right? And so as we read that passage or the sentence, you probably constructed through your attentional processes and read the cat ate the rat. Okay. So these demonstrate some important principles of attention. In this particular next one, the next one, you'll see this was in a classic experiment of attentional processing. In this particular visual array, it doesn't look exactly the same. So some people don't get it, but you'll see in the first line of pictures, the first row, you'll see that those are all faces. And in the second row, you'll see that they're all animals. Students that were given, or subjects that were given these arrays, perceived that last one, the one that looks like an older bald gentleman with glasses or a mouse, as being one or the other, depending on the context. And so the context within which you're attending to information also plays an influence on how you're attending and how you're processing. Let's go ahead and talk about some strategies. So because we can't attend to more than one thing at once, it's really important to set up, I mentioned limiting technology and other interruptions, but it's also really important to sort of set a time and a place to work. And we found from the research that consistency is better. So if you're really planful about your study time and your study location, that can be really helpful to your academic success. When you're reading, attend to signals. We call them attentional signals or signals, such as the headings and any font changes. I noticed that in the beginning when we talked about what are some things that you would do if you were reading for comprehension, some people mentioned that they might be looking at headings or they might write those headings down. That's a really good attentional strategy. It also provides a structure for you to help recall. If you're in a lecture, when a faculty member maybe does a vocal variation, like they say something slightly different, or maybe a little louder or a little lower, that tends to be a signal for auditory processing that's important information. Or they might even repeat content, right? Say it more slowly, something like that. That you should attend to as a student who's taking notes. We do know that underlining and highlighting facilitate attention, but you have to do it selectively. I don't know if any of you've ever seen a used textbook that looked like a coloring book where somebody ran through all different colors and highlighted everything. That's not going to be helpful. You have to selectively highlight or underline to help your comprehension. One thing that is a good strategy for attention is to code your notes. So some people have like shorthand that they use. Maybe they use a symbol. Maybe if they underline things or they put a star next to things that are definitions, or maybe they highlight an example or something like that. Using those types of codes in your notes can be a really helpful attentional strategy, and it can also help you go back and focus on those notes in a meaningful way. Okay. When you're reading, attending to root words and related word meanings help. If somebody provides you a model that you can write on, that can be very helpful. And then one of the things that we know is that students tend to skip over when they're reading their textbooks, they tend to skip over figures and tables, but those can really provide a lot of essential information and provide a structure to help you recall information. So please pay attention to figures and tables when you're reading your text. We see that especially in the science areas. So I'm saying that you can only attend to one thing at a time. Well, what happens is we can sometimes make things require less attention, and we call that automaticity or time sharing. Right? In automaticity, you probably remember when you were a student, a younger student, you like learned your math facts to a level of automaticity. So you didn't have to think about them when you were solving harder math problems, right? That would be an example. Or reading has the actual reading process, not the comprehension process, for many of you has already reached a level of automaticity. What we know from automaticity is that it doesn't require very much effort or thought. It's faster than thinking about things. It's actually more accurate unless you learn something wrong. You can do other things at the same time. You don't have to understand something that's reached a level of automaticity. So sometimes we know that students will memorize their math facts, but they don't really understand what addition or subtraction or multiplication means. And generally we say that something that's reached a level of automaticity is not forgotten. You can't get rid of it. Now, there's an unlearning and relearning process that we don't need to go into today, but generally we say something is not forgotten. So not everything can become automatic, but some tasks can become time shared. So do you remember when you were first learning to drive and you were sort of like, you had your hands on the wheel and please don't talk to me and I can't have the radio on, and you had to focus all of your attention on driving? Well, over time, what we know is that because you become more efficient at driving and you know where the turn signal is, right? You could start to do other tasks. It's not that driving isn't taking any of your attention. We can kind of see what else might be going on while you're driving. It's not necessarily taking all of your attention because some of the parts of driving have become automatic. Now, driving itself never becomes fully automatic. And that's evidenced by, you know, if you're driving, even if you think like, oh, I don't even remember driving home. But if something had jumped out in front of you in the road, you would have braked, of course, right? So it's still taking processing. It's just taking less processing. But we can take this principle. We can go to the next slide. We can take this principle and think about it from a learning perspective, right? So some tasks can reach a level of automaticity or be time shared. And this frees up your abilities to do other things, attention, working memory, and encoding. It makes things more available for learning. So one thing that you can do as a student is to consider where you might be able to reduce your cognitive load. Okay? I mentioned math facts. I'm telling you right now, if you don't know your math facts and you have to take a math class yet, it's worth it. It's not too late and it can help you. It'll really pay off. The same thing with learning formulas in your science classes and in your math classes and in other classes as well. Anytime that I think about stat, if you need formulas, if you memorize those formulas, it'll free up some processing time. The same thing in your lab classes. If you can make some of the procedures that you need to use to set up labs or to even take down labs, that can be helpful in freeing up resources to be thinking about the work in the lab. Most of you are very effective typers, but you can imagine what it would be like if you had to think about typing and how much time that would take. So typing is a great example of something that you do automatically that frees up processing time. Just like I said with math, reading, if you are not a good reader and you know you're not a good reader, you're very metacognitive about it, it's not too late to become a better reader. And one of the things that I suggest to students that I work with who are not good readers when they get to college is it doesn't matter what you're reading, right? You can go back and read Harry Potter books, and you can go back and read things that you maybe read when you were younger and build up that fluency. And it'll help you. It'll help you in your academic pursuits. Setting up routines is important, as I mentioned, and also kind of chunking, keeping kind of like things together. We do this with phone numbers. We do it with social security numbers. If you make the bits of things that you have to remember a little bit bigger, it can save some processing time. So those are some strategies for attention. Now, I mentioned when we're learning, everything is caught up by our processing, and we have to attend to things. If we don't attend to information, then it's lost, essentially. We can't get it back. Once information is attended to, it moves into working memory, but working memory is limited. And so what we need to do is we need to get the information into long-term memory. And the way that we do that is that we encode, we call it encoding. We get our information into our long-term storage, and we do that through adding meaning. And that's where we're going to focus the rest of our discussion today, is on adding meaning.
Okay, time for another little activity, a little brain activity, if you will. So we're going to, in just a second here, we're going to present to you a list of, I believe it's 12 words, 12 to 15 words. And we're going to give you 8 seconds to study these words, okay? And then we're going to remove the list, and then I will ask you to hold that information in your working memory for approximately 5 seconds, and then I'll ask you to write it down. So if you have a piece of paper or a Word document open, that will help you with this activity so that you can write it down as quickly as possible. So, okay, is everybody, yeah, looks like everybody's about ready. So let's go ahead and present that list, study those words. All right, hold it now, hold it. Don't write anything yet. Okay, now try to remember them, write them down. I'll give everybody a few seconds to remember. Okay, looks like most people have finished writing. Okay, if we can go back and bring that list back up for the words. Yeah, I think you have to press back. Yeah, there you go. Okay, how did people do? Do you want to just put your answers in the chat or unmute, or? Yeah, either one works. How many did you remember? Okay, Madison got down to shovel. That's looks like 5. Yeah, pretty good. Okay, 4. Yeah, 4, 5, 6. Wow, pretty consistent. Yeah, looks like anywhere between 3 and 6 words. Yeah, that's about what we would expect, actually. So that's kind of cool to see kind of the research pan out in our example here. Yeah, 3 to 6 words. Okay, now I'm going to present you this another list of words, but I'm going to present them a little bit differently. So it's going to be the same procedure. Okay, so we will show you the list. We'll show it to you for about 8 seconds, and then we're going to take it away. Then I'll have you hold, and then I'll have you remember them. So is everybody ready? All right, let's go ahead and show that list of words. All right, hold it now. 5 seconds, hold it. All right, go ahead and write down what you remember. Hopefully you found this one a little bit easier. Okay, it looks like most people are about done. Go ahead and put your answers in the chat. How many did you, and we can bring the list back up. Yep, and then, yeah, go ahead and grade yourself and put your answers in the chat. How many did you remember? Oh, all right, oh, wow, yeah, we're getting 9. Yeah, we're pushing it now. We've got 9, 7, 8. Yeah, pretty consistently, a lot more words were remembered. And this kind of illustrates a really important aspect of our memory and of how our brain works. And it's called encoding, and what we just did in that last group of words is we used an organizational strategy. So part of how we learn and part of the important part of learning is encoding. It's this process where we move information from our working memory into our long-term memory, right? So things in working memory are conscious, right? And in order for us to be able to remember them for a long time or to be able to remember it later on down the road, we need to get it into our long-term memory for long-term storage. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can promote our encoding into long-term memory, right? And we can use organization, and we can also use elaboration as part of the as strategies to help us encode. So organization refers to the processes we use to make connections or to see relationships within the parts of to be learned information, right? So let's say we're learning about the solar system. We want to be able to make these connections about planets, the star, moons, things like that, make meaningful connections among those parts. Now, elaboration is related, it's kind of similar, but it refers to the processes that we use to make connections or to see relationships between what we already know and the information that we're trying to learn. Okay, so we're connecting our prior knowledge. We're making it meaningful to us through elaboration. And we have several examples here of what it might look like, visual representations of what organizational processing might look like. So let's say we're learning about transfused blood or blood transfusions. We could try to remember all of these individual components of the process of transfusing blood. We could try to remember the concept of rejection or the concept of disease factors or RH, but they're not really it's not gonna be very easy to remember those things unless we add meaning to them and we relate them to each other. So the term rejection would make very little sense if it were not organized correctly within this knowledge web. And by the way, we would consider this knowledge web a schema of our transfusion, blood transfusion concept. Okay, so on to the next one. We can also organize information in kind of a hierarchical fashion. So some may kind of recognize this as Bloom's taxonomy or version of Bloom's taxonomy. So we could organize, for example, types of test questions, right? And we can organize it based on what cognitive processing is required to answer the test question, whether it's a simple definition question in the middle for knowledge, or if we go all the way out to the edge, do we have to assess, rank, select, and make recommendations about something? So that's another way that we can organize information. Now, in the next one, we've all probably seen these, right? Venn diagrams. Venn diagrams are really good at organizing information to make similarities and differences become apparent, right? So in the A column or in the A category, that's something unique to item A, something unique to item B, and then in the middle, something that they both share. The next one, yeah, this organization shows different categories of web tools, for example. And it's also kind of hierarchical. If you can see, we start with web search tools. We break it out into 3 categories: search engines, subject directories, and meta search tools. And then we can kind of categorize each of these individual search engines into their respective categories. The next one looks pretty similar. And you've probably seen these before as well. It's a flow chart. So we can not only organize information, but we can also organize decision-making processes, right? So let's say that we are out in the wilderness, we're out for a hike, and we want to know if we can do a certain action. Well, we can kind of use this decision-making process, this flow chart, to help us figure out what we need to do in a given scenario. And then this final one You may have seen something like this before in your lecture slides, or maybe you do this in your own notes. We can make a matrix or a table to compare information, right? And that's a really good way to show relationships. So for example, maybe we are comparing gorillas to chimps, right? Item 1 might be the gorillas, item 2 might be chimps. We can compare gorillas and chimps on a couple of different topics. So how they move, what they primarily eat, where they live. We can kind of fill in those boxes. And in doing so, it really helps us kind of make connections among those parts and among that information. And it also helps us make comparisons. All right. So it's really important to try to use organizational strategies when we're reading, right? For example, so one way that we can do that is to stop and summarize what we've read frequently. You may have heard of the suggestion to stop every paragraph or every page. I think that's a great idea. And that's also, that can be a metacognitive check as well to say, do I really know what this page is talking about? We can also generate main ideas of sections of text. I think I heard that in the beginning of what people said, what strategies people use. And we also want to make connections between tables, graphs, and text. As Rayne was saying earlier, we know that a lot of students will oftentimes just kind of breeze over tables, not really look at graphs, not really look at figures. It is really important to try to make connections between what the text is saying and those visuals. And we can also use organizational strategies when taking notes. And so note taking is really important. One, because it does help us encode, but more importantly, it serves as external storage for our information. It would be really hard to go through an hour-long lecture and absorb, it would be impossible actually to absorb everything the lecturer says without writing down any notes. And so that's really the main purpose of taking notes, is it helps us kind of hold this information on an external drive, if you will, being your notepad, so that we can go back to it later and study it and kind of relearn it. And so when you, if you want to go back one more, and so when we're taking notes, after we've taken notes or while we're taking notes, we can use these organizational strategies to help keep our notes organized and meaningful. So we can use matrices, like that last example that I had with the chimps and the gorillas. We can use outlines, we can use tables, graphs, timelines, we can create hierarchical notes, right? So we start with a broader category, we make notes about subcategories and particular details. And we can also reorder and regroup notes once we've taken them. All right, so moving on. We can also group for meaning, of course. So let's say we have several math or chemistry or even physics problems. Maybe we want to group those problems into problem types. So maybe we'll group it into geometry problems, algebra problems, calculus problems, things like that. And we can kind of tackle it that way. Or maybe we can kind of create rules or certain information for us that might apply to these particular types of problems that we can remember for later. We can also categorize things. So let's say we have categories of theories. We can categorize these theories based on, let's say in learning, for example, does the theory assume that the human is agentic? Do they have free will? Or does the theory not assume that? We can also order events. So let's say we're studying history, we want to put events in order, and we can kind of group for meaning in that way. Steps in a sequence would be another example of that. Making compare and contrast charts, great idea for organizational strategies. You might use a Venn diagram to do that. And then finally, as Rayne mentioned earlier, we want to listen and read for signal words that are indicative of relationships. So some words that might indicate a relationship could be, let's say it says however, or while. So while the gorilla lives typically on the ground, a chimpanzee might spend much of its time in the trees, for example. So listening for those types of words can signal that there's a relationship there. All right, and I think at this point, Ing is going to walk us through the more fun brain games.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So now it's on time for another very fun game. So to play with this game, I'll need to divide you guys into 3 groups. So if your last name begins with A to H, then you're in group 1. And if your last name begins with I to Q, then you're group 2. And if your last name begins with R to Z, then you're group 3. So I will start with group 1. And when I do this activates group 1, I'll need group 2 and group 3 to close your eyes, or you could look away. Just don't cheat. And when we'll do the same for group 2 and group 3. So group 1, if you're ready, group 2 and group 3, please close your eyes or look away. Thank you. Okay, so group 1, seems like everybody is ready. Pay attention. So just do as the directions shown on the slide. You have 8 seconds. Okay, now you can write it down. So group 1, please close your eyes, and group 2, you can open your eyes, and group 3, please keep your eyes closed. Okay, so group 2, pay attention. Please follow the directions on this slide. You will have 8 seconds starting now. And then you can write down the answer on a piece of paper. Okay, so group 1 and group 2, please close your eyes, and group 3, please open your eyes. Now you're ready for this game. Okay, you have 8 seconds starting now. Time's up. Okay, so group 3 now can write down your answers on a piece of paper. Okay, now everybody can open your eyes. Thank you for your cooperation. I hope that was fun. So what we were just doing is actually we were mimicking a experimental study that we compared these 3 conditions. So what you see that is different for group 3 is that we are adding meanings to these words. So that helps us to remember these words better. And that is what we call elaboration. So elaboration is the most important for long-term retention. It helps learners to activate their prior knowledge. It also helps learners, to build connections with their prior knowledge. Elaborations help us to add meanings to the learning tasks so that they can remember the concepts or the facts better. And sometimes we also need to build our prior knowledge to be successful in learning. So there are a few that are quite commonly considered to be effective elaboration strategies. One is called elaborative integration. Elaborative integration refer that asking yourself why and how questions. Example can be a teacher showing students a set of facts or statements and asking them to ask themselves why, like why these statements or facts are true. So these processes actually help students to rationalize the facts or the concept that they're learning so that they can activate their prior knowledge and build connections with their prior knowledge so that they can remember those facts better. Generate their own example is another elaboration strategy. Self-explanation is when we ask students to self-talk through their problem-solving processes so that they're aware of what they're doing while completing a task. And also use and integrate multiple sources also help learners to add meanings and information to the task they're doing so that they can remember the information better. There are a few more elaboration strategies. One is make a picture or drawing. This may be more helpful or particularly more effective for a certain domain, such as biology. For example, when students learn about the structure of a cell, drawing it down may be really helpful. And also working with peers is another elaboration strategy because through working with peers provides additional examples and explanations to the task that they're working on so that they can build the meanings to what they're learning. And mnemonics are also elaboration strategies, and sometimes they can also be very helpful, although they're less effective than other elaboration strategies because they're less meaningful. But they also can be very helpful. For example, when students learn a second language, then they need to memorize a certain thing or certain grammar rules at a rote level. So mnemonics can be very helpful in this situation. Now I'm going to turn this over to Rayne.
Okay, thank you. So we're talking about organization and elaboration. So organization is seeing relationships within to be learned information. So the content that you're learning, trying to see patterns, see how things compare and contrast, how they're related, how they may be sequentially ordered. So organization is very important. Elaboration is also really critical. And the most effective way to remember things or to store things and be able to retrieve them is through elaborative processing strategies. So adding what you already know to what it is you're trying to learn. But sometimes in our efforts to make things simple, we might take away context that would help us activate that prior knowledge to be able to build understanding. So I took this example out of a 5th grade textbook, and I use it because everybody can relate to it. In the textbook, they use the term North American Indian homes. I know that there may be some other preferable terms, but that was directly from the textbook. And you can imagine your 5th grade social studies textbook, right? And it had pictures of different, it was very decorative pictures. And it basically had 3 lines, right? It said, Southwest North American Indians lived in homes made of earth, while the Northwest American Indians lived in homes made with wooden, that were made with wood with sloped roofs, and while the Plains Indians, in this case, made homes from hides. And basically what that meant was the student was required to memorize these because there's nothing else there to help them remember, right? But if you remind students that in the Northwest, it rains a lot and there's a lot of trees, or on the plains that there are very few trees, but there were a lot of buffalo at that time, right? So if you add that extra meaning, if you add that context, then it provides you an opportunity to make those important connections. And so sometimes what we see is students try to memorize things at a very basic level, and because they're not making those connections, they have a very hard time retrieving them. And so our purpose today was to try to help you think through how can you make these things meaningful and add them to your own prior knowledge. We can look at that next slide. This is a funny little example that I sometimes use when I work with college students. So the procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. As you read through this passage, and I have several of these different types of passages, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense until you activate the prior knowledge that this is about laundry, right? And once you've activated that prior knowledge, you know a lot about laundry probably, right? Oh yeah, it's a procedure. It is, yep, I'm going to group things by color, and then I'm going to, right? You're going to work through the process of sorting and doing laundry. So sometimes it's important for us to remember that we have to activate our prior knowledge, and we have to connect what it is that we're learning to something that we already know. On the next slide, we talked a little bit about different types of mnemonics. Mnemonics are memory tricks, and students like to use them. They work because they're elaborations, because you're either making a song, sometimes you might make a song up, or you might chain things together, or you might use a first letter mnemonic for like the solar system, or something like FOIL for multiplying binomials, right? Those things do work because they are elaborations, but they're not very meaningful ones. And so it's much more successful to use meaningful connections with your prior knowledge than to use mnemonics. But as Ing mentioned, you can use mnemonics as sort of a cleanup strategy. And we'll make these slides available to you. There's some links there about how to use mnemonics. So let's revisit the strategies that that you listed at the beginning of the session today. For each one, do you think it's an effective strategy? And if so, why? And what type of strategy is it? Was it an attentional strategy? Was it something that was a signaling strategy that was going to help you? I know some of you listed organizational strategies like summarization and main idea. Did any of you think about some strategies that might be elaborative, like tying it to something that you already knew, or maybe content, remembering how you took calculus in high school and how it's different and the same as your calculus class now? So one thing that we would do is we would suggest, like, what are some attentional strategies you might use? What are some organizational strategies you might use? And what might you use as an elaboration? And I'm seeing some things in the chat. I'm glad you're going to use Venn diagrams more. That's good. I think that, okay, let's see. Questions from students. I try to remember what I read, but if I don't memorize, then I forget and I don't do well on my exams. Is memorization in college a strategy? Adding meaning is a strategy. So one of the things that people, when they try to memorize, they kind of just use maybe like flashcards, or they do something like that where they reread and reread and reread. And that's not really a very effective strategy. You really need to regroup things, organize them, or use elaborations. Should I be concerned about my mental health if I can't remember just 20 minutes after reading? My guess would be that I think if you're concerned about your mental health, you should seek some assistance. But sometimes what happens when students say that they have a hard time remembering, even just after reading, it's because they're not really constructing when they're reading. And it's sort of that example that we were using with that the man was worried example. So maybe you go through your textbook or you go through what it is you have to read, and you sort of aren't really interrogating yourself and making sure that you're understanding what you're reading, because some of the processes of reading are automatic. Okay, Venn diagrams. Other questions that you might have that we can answer? We have a few minutes left today. We were going to go back over strategies, but it seems like people have some questions. You can close that and we can kind of see everybody. Anybody have questions that they'd like to ask about studying or strategies they're using that they think are successful that other people might benefit from? I can't see hands very well. Yeah, Madison.
Sometimes I don't highlight things right away. I'll take my notes first, and then when I'm done taking notes, I'll go back and highlight it so I have a chance to read my notes again.
Yeah, sometimes students rewrite their notes, and I would suggest if you're going to rewrite your notes, that you might regroup them when you do that and reorganize them, because that can help. What we know is that students take down about 30% of what's presented in a lecture. Okay. Now there's a little bit of a dance, right? The instructors know that you're not going to take everything down, so they repeat things that are important, so you make sure that you get those down. But one of the things that we know is that it's really hard to study from lecture notes that are incomplete, right? So one thing that I encourage students to do all the time is to share lecture notes. You know, find someone else and try to get the most complete set of notes to study from. You may remember Joe was talking about having external storage. If you have a really complete set of lecture notes, you're going to be in a much better place. Other people have a strategy that they want to ask about or talk about with everyone? Let's see the chat. Reading is mechanical and automatic. Here are 4 questions that often get to the root of the challenge of remembering what you read. Thoughts on using platforms like, I'm not sure what that, does somebody want to clarify that? Parts of reading are automatic, but comprehension isn't. So comprehension is when we add meaning. And so it's really important to, yeah, okay. So thank you. Am I reading too fast? Am I reading too much? These are, am I reading in the right environment? Am I reading with the right frame of mind? So these are really great metacognitive questions that you can ask yourself about the reading that you're doing. And I think that, thank you, Joe, for sharing those. I think that those could be really helpful for students. one of the things that you mentioned here, am I reading too much? One of the things that students try to do is they try to read or they try to study in too big a chunks of time. Okay, so we know that you can't sustain your attention and you're studying for long periods of time. And so distributed practice and going back to content over a longer period of time is helpful. So one of my colleagues, Charles Woodson, out at Berkeley, did a study with biology students. And what he did was he had students come 10 minutes before class in one condition. And those students activated their prior knowledge right before class. They reread what happened in the class beforehand, and he saw huge gains in their academic performance. And so if you get to class a little bit early, if you could do that in Zoom, I don't know if you're in person at all right now. We have both right now, hybrid and in-person classes. But anyway, my point is, if you can, before you get to the class to engage in it, and you stop and you take 10 minutes to review before, it will make a big difference in what you're going to be learning from that lecture or from that class, because you're activating your recent prior knowledge. Helena?
Yeah, hi. I came late, so you may have already mentioned this, but I noticed when Madison talked about highlighting and but then had the strategy of going back, which is good. But I think that sometime you might have mentioned that just highlighting itself is probably not very effective. You probably already said that.
No, well, and what I said was, I said that selective underlining or highlighting, it can be effective as a sampling tool, but that students really over highlight. And it's good for attracting attention, but it's not really good for learning. So it's kind of the first step. So thank you, yeah, for revisiting that.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? I'm going to put my email in the chat. And so if people have questions or they want additional resources or anything like that, you can reach back to me. And I think in the slides, we can share those slides with you. We have 2 articles. I'm sorry, I asked you to put that down, Ing. Would you mind putting it back up real quick? So there's 2 really good articles that are written for primarily college students and other students. One is by Dunlowski called Strengthening the Student Toolbox. Can you put the hyperlink in the text, please, Joe or Ing? And then the other one is Willingham's article, the Strategies That Make Learning Last. These are both cognitive psychologists, educational psychologists, sort of like me, who study student academic success. And these 2 articles are written for students, and they can be really helpful in helping you think through some strategies that you might want to use in the future. Did we get those hyperlinks in there? Yep, great. Thank you. We can probably take any additional questions. I think we just had a little bit of time today, so anything else? Well, thank you everyone for coming. It was really great to be here. And I appreciated the opportunity to meet you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again for please attending. I really do appreciate. We appreciate you so much spending time with us, and especially hearing from Dr. Sperling and our graduate assistants. We really do appreciate you being here. And thank you so much again, Rayne, Joseph, and Ying, for being here. We greatly appreciate. We have absolutely learned a lot. Our next academic resilience session is going to be on March the 18th at 12 o'clock. And that one is going to be facilitated by Dr. Jason Becker. He's an associate professor in the psychology department at Millersville University. And you'll be seeing the flyer in the coming weeks. Thank you so much again. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.